Question 1. Market research demonstrates a growing interest among retail investors in highly speculative, emerging technology stocks. A long-standing client who has a moderate risk tolerance and a conservative investment objective focused on capital preservation expresses a strong desire to invest a significant portion of their portfolio in one such stock, citing anecdotal evidence and social media trends. The client is insistent, stating they don't want to miss out. As their financial advisor, what is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Immediately execute the client's requested trade to maintain client satisfaction and avoid potential conflict, as the client is insistent. Option B. Advise the client to seek a second opinion from another financial advisor who might be more amenable to their investment preferences. Option C. Conduct a thorough suitability assessment. Explain the risks associated with the speculative stock in relation to the client's stated objectives and risk tolerance, and if deemed unsuitable, clearly articulate why and recommend alternative, more appropriate investments. Option D. Agree to the investment, but suggest the client move the majority of their portfolio to a separate account to isolate the risk. Correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough suitability assessment. Explain the risks associated with the speculative stock in relation to the client's stated objectives and risk tolerance, and if deemed unsuitable, clearly articulate why and recommend alternative, more appropriate investments. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's desire for a specific investment outcome and the advisor's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, adhering strictly to regulatory guidelines. The advisor must navigate the client's potentially misinformed enthusiasm for a high-risk, speculative product without succumbing to pressure that could lead to unsuitable recommendations. The challenge lies in balancing client satisfaction with regulatory compliance and ethical responsibility. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing the client's best interests and adhering to regulatory requirements for suitability. This involves a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, investment objectives, risk tolerance, and knowledge of investments. The advisor must then explain in clear and understandable terms why the proposed investment, despite the client's interest, is not suitable. This aligns with the principles of client care and the regulatory obligation to ensure that any recommended investment is appropriate for the individual client. The advisor's role is to educate and guide, not simply to execute client instructions that could be detrimental. Incorrect approaches analysis. Recommending the speculative product without a proper suitability assessment would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This breaches the duty to act in the client's best interest and could violate regulations requiring advisors to understand their client's circumstances before making recommendations. It prioritizes potential commission or client appeasement over client welfare. Agreeing to the client's request solely to maintain the relationship without conducting the necessary due diligence is also a failure. This demonstrates a lack of professional integrity and a disregard for regulatory obligations. It suggests that client retention is valued more than responsible advice, potentially exposing both the advisor and the client to undue risk and regulatory scrutiny. Suggesting the client seek advice from another professional without first attempting to explain the suitability concerns is a missed opportunity to fulfill the advisor's duty. While referring clients is sometimes appropriate, doing so as a primary response to a suitability issue without engaging in the required assessment and explanation can be seen as an abdication of responsibility. It fails to uphold the advisor's commitment to providing informed guidance. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with understanding the client's stated needs and then rigorously applying regulatory frameworks and ethical principles. This involves 1. Active listening to understand the client's request and underlying motivations. 2. Conducting a comprehensive client needs assessment, financial situation, objectives, risk tolerance, knowledge. 3. Evaluating the proposed investment against the client's profile and regulatory suitability rules. 4. Clearly communicating the assessment findings and rationale to the client, explaining why an investment is or is not suitable. 5. Documenting all discussions, assessments, and recommendations. 6. If a client insists on an unsuitable course of action, the professional must clearly explain the risks and potential consequences, and if necessary, consider disengaging from the relationship if it cannot be conducted ethically and compliantly. Question 2. The audit findings indicate a discrepancy in the reported financial figures for a key client account. The client, upon reviewing the draft audit report, has strongly contested the accuracy of these figures and requested an immediate revision to align with their internal records, suggesting that the audit team may have misinterpreted certain transaction details. Option A. Immediately revise the audit findings to match the client's internal records to maintain a positive client relationship and avoid further disputes. Option B. Inform the client that the audit findings are final and cannot be changed, without conducting any further review of their concerns. Option C. Seek guidance from the client's external legal counsel on how to address the disputed audit findings to ensure compliance with their legal obligations. Option D. Independently re-examine the audit working papers and supporting documentation related to the disputed financial figures to verify their accuracy and completeness before responding to the client. The correct answer is D. Independently re-examine the audit working papers and supporting documentation related to the disputed financial figures to verify their accuracy and completeness before responding to the client. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's desire for a specific outcome and the auditor's duty to provide an objective and independent assessment. The auditor must navigate the pressure to please the client while upholding the integrity of the audit process and adhering to the CATL hiring assessment test's regulatory framework. The challenge lies in distinguishing between legitimate client requests for clarification or additional information and attempts to influence the audit findings or conclusions. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the audit working papers and supporting documentation to verify the accuracy and completeness of the findings. This aligns with the CATL hiring assessment test's emphasis on evidence-based conclusions and professional skepticism. By independently re-examining the data, the auditor demonstrates adherence to the principles of due professional care and objectivity, ensuring that the audit report reflects the true state of affairs rather than a client-influenced narrative. This upholds the integrity of the audit profession and the reliability of the information provided. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to immediately concede to the client's request to alter the findings without independent verification. This would constitute a breach of professional ethics and regulatory guidelines by compromising auditor independence and objectivity. It could lead to misrepresentation of facts, potentially misleading stakeholders, and undermining the credibility of the audit. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's concerns outright without a proper review. While maintaining objectivity is crucial, ignoring client feedback without due consideration can be perceived as unprofessional and may overlook genuine errors or misunderstandings. This could lead to a breakdown in the professional relationship and potentially result in a flawed audit if the client's concerns, upon review, highlight a genuine oversight. A third incorrect approach would be to seek external advice from the client's legal counsel regarding the audit findings. This would violate the principle of auditor independence, as the auditor should not be influenced by parties with a vested interest in the outcome of the audit. The auditor's professional judgment should be based on the audit evidence and relevant professional standards, not on advice from the client's representatives. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process when faced with client challenges to audit findings. This involves 1. Active listening. Understand the client's specific concerns and the basis for their disagreement. 2. Evidence review. Independently re-examine the audit working papers and supporting evidence related to the disputed findings. 3. Consultation. If necessary, consult with internal senior colleagues or a designated quality control reviewer to ensure objectivity and adherence to standards. 4. Communication. Clearly and professionally communicate the findings and the rationale behind them to the client, providing explanations supported by evidence. 5. Documentation. Meticulously document all discussions, reviews, and decisions made throughout the process. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are well-founded, defensible, and uphold professional integrity. Question 3. The risk matrix shows a moderate likelihood and moderate impact for operational disruptions arising from staff not being fully trained on upcoming changes to client reporting regulations. Which of the following actions best addresses this identified risk in line with regulatory expectations? Option A. Rely on existing general compliance training, assuming staff can adapt to the new regulations with minimal additional instruction. Option B. Develop and implement a comprehensive training program specifically tailored to the new client reporting regulations, including practical exercises and post-training assessments to ensure competency. Option C. Conduct a brief, one-time overview session on the new regulations, with no follow-up or verification of understanding. Option D. Assign the responsibility for understanding and implementing the new regulations to individual team members, without formal training or centralized oversight. The correct answer is B. Develop and implement a comprehensive training program specifically tailored to the new client reporting regulations, including practical exercises and post-training assessments to ensure competency. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge in financial services, balancing the need for robust risk management with the practicalities of operational efficiency and client service. The risk matrix, a standard tool for assessing potential threats, highlights a moderate likelihood and impact for operational disruptions stemming from inadequate staff training on new regulatory reporting requirements. This requires a professional to not only identify the risk, but also to propose a proportionate and compliant response. The correct approach involves a proactive and comprehensive training program that directly addresses the identified regulatory gaps. This aligns with the core principles of regulatory compliance, which mandate that firms must have adequate systems and controls in place to meet their obligations. Specifically, it reflects the CATL hiring assessment test's emphasis on understanding and adhering to regulatory frameworks. Investing in thorough training ensures that staff are equipped to handle new requirements accurately, thereby mitigating the risk of errors, fines, and reputational damage. This proactive stance is best professional practice as it demonstrates a commitment to compliance and client protection. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the risk as minor due to its moderate rating, assuming existing general training is sufficient. This fails to acknowledge the specific nature of the new regulatory reporting requirements and the potential for unique challenges. Such an approach risks regulatory breaches, as it implies a lack of due diligence in understanding and implementing new rules. Another incorrect approach would be to implement a superficial, one-off training session without follow-up or assessment. This would not adequately embed the new knowledge or ensure competency, leaving the firm vulnerable to the very risks identified in the matrix. Ethically, this demonstrates a failure to act with due care and diligence in protecting the firm and its clients from regulatory noncompliance. A further incorrect approach might be to delegate the responsibility entirely to junior staff without adequate oversight or resources, which also fails to meet the firm's overarching responsibility for regulatory adherence. Professionals should approach such situations by first thoroughly understanding the risk identified, then evaluating the potential impact and likelihood. The next step is to consider a range of mitigation strategies, assessing each against regulatory requirements, ethical obligations, and operational feasibility. The chosen strategy should be proportionate to the risk and demonstrably effective in achieving compliance and protecting stakeholders. This involves a structured decision-making process that prioritizes regulatory adherence and client welfare. Question 4. Operational review demonstrates that a long-standing client, whose business activities are generally understood to be legitimate, has recently engaged in a series of complex, high-value international transactions that appear unusual in their timing and structure, deviating significantly from their historical transaction patterns. Several indicators within these transactions align with common red flags for money laundering, such as the use of multiple intermediaries and a lack of clear economic purpose. The firm's compliance officer has noted these anomalies. What is the most appropriate course of action for the firm in this situation, adhering strictly to UK regulatory frameworks and guidelines? Option A. Immediately cease all business with the client and file a SAR with the NCA, as any deviation from historical patterns with high-value international transactions is inherently suspicious. Option B. Ignore the anomalies as the client has a long-standing positive relationship with the firm, and the transactions, while unusual, do not definitively prove illicit activity. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive internal review of the transactions, documenting all findings and assessing the totality of the circumstances to determine if a reasonable suspicion of money laundering or terrorist financing exists, and if so, file a Suspicious Activity Report (SAR) with the National Crime Agency (NCA). Option D. Inform the client directly about the identified red flags and request an explanation before proceeding with any internal assessment or reporting. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive internal review of the transactions, documenting all findings and assessing the totality of the circumstances to determine if a reasonable suspicion of money laundering or terrorist financing exists, and if so, file a suspicious activity report (SAR) with the National Crime Agency (NCA). Explanation: Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between client confidentiality and the regulatory obligation to report suspicious activities. The firm's reputation, client trust, and potential legal repercussions hinge on the correct interpretation and application of anti-money laundering (AML) regulations. Navigating this requires a nuanced understanding of when suspicion crosses the threshold for reporting, balancing the need for thorough investigation with the imperative to act promptly when warranted. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough internal assessment of the red flags identified, documented in accordance with internal policies and regulatory guidance. This assessment should involve experienced compliance personnel who can evaluate the totality of the circumstances, considering the client's profile, the nature of the transactions, and any corroborating information. If after this assessment, a reasonable suspicion of money laundering or terrorist financing persists, the firm has a legal and ethical obligation to file a suspicious activity report (SAR) with the relevant authority. This aligns with the principles of the Proceeds of Crime Act 2002, (POCA), and the Money Laundering Regulations 2017, which mandate reporting to prevent financial crime and uphold the integrity of the financial system. Prompt and accurate reporting, based on a well-documented internal process, is best professional practice. Incorrect approach is analysis. Ignoring the red flags and continuing with the client relationship without further investigation would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This demonstrates a disregard for AML obligations and could expose the firm to severe penalties, including fines and reputational damage, for failing to identify and report suspicious activity as required by POCA. Filing a SAR immediately upon the first indication of a red flag, without conducting a proper internal assessment, is also professionally unacceptable. While vigilance is crucial, premature reporting without sufficient grounds can lead to unnecessary investigations, strain regulatory resources, and potentially damage client relationships without a justifiable basis. This approach fails to adhere to the principle of reasonable suspicion, which requires more than a mere hunch. Consulting only with the client about the identified red flags before making a reporting decision is a critical breach of confidentiality and a direct violation of AML regulations. Discussing suspicions with the client would tip them off, allowing them to conceal or move illicit funds, thereby frustrating the purpose of the reporting regime and potentially aiding in the commission of a criminal offense. This action would also likely breach professional conduct rules regarding client confidentiality in a manner that undermines regulatory objectives. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should follow a structured decision-making process. 1. Identify and document all red flags. 2. Conduct a thorough internal risk assessment considering the client's profile and transaction patterns. 3. Consult internal compliance policies and relevant regulatory guidance. 4. If reasonable suspicion persists after the assessment, prepare and submit a SAR. 5. Maintain detailed records of the assessment and reporting process. 6. Avoid any communication with the client that could tip them off to the suspicion. Question 5. Benchmark analysis indicates that a long-standing, high-value client has recently engaged in a series of transactions that, while not explicitly illegal on their face, exhibit several unusual patterns and a lack of clear economic or business rationale. These patterns align with indicators of potential money laundering activities, as outlined in the CATL hiring assessment test's regulatory guidelines. The firm's compliance officer has been alerted to these transactions. Which of the following actions best aligns with the regulatory framework and professional best practices for handling such a situation? Option A. Immediately cease all business with the client and report the transactions as suspicious to the relevant authorities without further internal review. Option B. Confront the client directly with the observed transaction patterns and request an explanation before taking any further action. Option C. Continue processing the client's transactions as usual, assuming the client is acting within legal bounds, and avoid any internal inquiries to prevent jeopardizing the client relationship. Option D. Conduct a discrete internal review to gather additional information and context regarding the transactions, and if suspicions persist, file a suspicious activity report, SAR, with the appropriate regulatory body. The correct answer is A. Immediately cease all business with the client and report the transactions as suspicious to the relevant authorities without further internal review. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between client confidentiality and the regulatory obligation to report suspicious activities. The firm's reputation and client trust are at stake, requiring a nuanced approach that balances legal duties with ethical considerations. Careful judgment is paramount to avoid both breaching confidentiality and failing to meet regulatory requirements. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to the CATL hiring assessment test's regulatory framework, specifically concerning anti-money laundering (AML) and suspicious activity reporting (SAR) obligations. This approach involves discreetly gathering further information to confirm suspicions without tipping off the client, and then, if suspicions persist, filing a SAR with the relevant authority as mandated by the regulations. This demonstrates a commitment to regulatory compliance and ethical conduct, safeguarding the firm and the integrity of the financial system. An incorrect approach that involves immediately confronting the client with the suspicions, without further investigation, would likely breach client confidentiality and could alert the client to the ongoing investigation, potentially leading to the destruction of evidence or further illicit activity. This failure to follow established procedures for handling suspicious activity is a direct contravention of regulatory expectations. Another incorrect approach, that of ignoring the red flags due to the client's importance, represents a severe ethical and regulatory failure. It implies a willingness to overlook potential criminal activity for commercial gain, undermining the firm's integrity and exposing it to significant legal and reputational risks. This demonstrates a lack of professional judgment and a disregard for the firm's duty to report. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying potential red flags. This is followed by a thorough understanding of the relevant regulatory obligations, including reporting thresholds and procedures. The next step involves discrete internal consultation and information gathering to corroborate suspicions. If suspicions remain, the professional must then initiate the formal reporting process as dictated by the regulations, ensuring all documentation is accurate and complete. This structured approach ensures that decisions are informed, compliant, and ethically sound. Question 6. When evaluating a client's request to structure an investment in a manner that appears to minimize tax liabilities through a complex series of transactions, what is the most appropriate initial professional response according to the CATL hiring assessment test's regulatory framework? Option A. Proceed with the proposed structure, but focus solely on the transactional mechanics, without delving into the client's ultimate financial goals or regulatory adherence. Option B. Seek to understand the client's specific objectives and the underlying rationale for their preferred investment structure, while simultaneously assessing its compliance with all relevant tax laws and financial regulations. Option C. Advise the client that such complex tax minimization strategies are generally not permissible and suggest a simpler, more conventional investment approach. Option D. Immediately implement the proposed investment structure as requested by the client, assuming their understanding of tax implications is sufficient. The correct answer is B. Seek to understand the client's specific objectives and the underlying rationale for their preferred investment structure, while simultaneously assessing its compliance with all relevant tax laws and financial regulations. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated wishes and the potential for those wishes to lead to regulatory noncompliance or unethical practices. The advisor must navigate the delicate balance of client advocacy with their fiduciary duty and adherence to the CATL hiring assessment test's regulatory framework. The challenge lies in identifying the subtle indicators of potential misconduct and responding appropriately without alienating the client or compromising professional integrity. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. It involves a proactive and investigative stance, seeking clarification and additional information to understand the underlying intent and potential implications of the client's request. This aligns with the CATL hiring assessment test's emphasis on due diligence, client understanding, and adherence to all applicable laws and guidelines. By seeking to understand the why behind the request and exploring compliant alternatives, the advisor upholds their fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest while also safeguarding against regulatory breaches. This approach reflects a commitment to professional integrity and responsible financial advice. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately fulfilling the client's request without further inquiry. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement for due diligence and understanding the client's objectives and risk tolerance. It could lead to facilitating a transaction that is not in the client's best interest or, worse, is in violation of regulatory rules, exposing both the client and the advisor to significant risk. This approach demonstrates a lack of professional skepticism and a failure to uphold the advisor's responsibility to act with prudence. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's request outright without attempting to understand their motivations or explore compliant alternatives. While the intention might be to avoid potential issues, this can be perceived as unhelpful or dismissive, potentially damaging the client relationship and failing to identify legitimate, albeit perhaps complex, client needs that could be met within regulatory boundaries. It misses an opportunity to educate the client and guide them towards appropriate solutions. A further incorrect approach involves seeking to circumvent the spirit of the regulations while technically adhering to the letter. This is a form of regulatory arbitrage that, while potentially appearing clever, is ethically unsound and often leads to unintended consequences or future regulatory scrutiny. It demonstrates a lack of commitment to the underlying principles of the regulatory framework and a disregard for the intent behind the rules. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a framework of understand, assess, and advise. First, thoroughly understand the client's request and the rationale behind it. Second, assess the request against the relevant regulatory framework, ethical guidelines, and the client's best interests. This assessment should involve identifying potential risks and compliance issues. Third, advise the client on the findings, explaining any limitations or concerns, and proposing compliant and suitable alternatives. This iterative process ensures that advice is both client-centric and compliant. Question 7. Strategic planning requires a firm to consider its future growth trajectory. If a firm is contemplating a significant expansion into a new financial product area, what is the most prudent initial step to ensure this expansion aligns with regulatory expectations and ethical conduct as per the CATL framework? Option A. Delegate the responsibility for regulatory compliance entirely to the legal and compliance departments, allowing the business development team to proceed with expansion plans independently. Option B. Immediately begin developing marketing materials and sales strategies to capture market share quickly, assuming compliance can be addressed once the product is launched. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive review of all applicable regulations and guidelines related to the new product area, assessing potential compliance risks and developing mitigation strategies before committing significant resources. Option D. Focus primarily on the potential profitability of the new product area, with a secondary consideration for regulatory requirements only if they become an immediate obstacle. Correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive review of all applicable regulations and guidelines related to the new product area, assessing potential compliance risks and developing mitigation strategies before committing significant resources. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the firm's strategic growth objectives with the stringent regulatory obligations and ethical duties owed to clients and the market. The CATL hiring assessment test, by its nature, assesses an individual's understanding of these critical areas. The core of the challenge lies in identifying and implementing strategies that are not only commercially viable, but also fully compliant with the regulatory framework governing financial services. This demands a nuanced understanding of how business development intersects with compliance, risk management, and client protection. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough understanding and integration of the regulatory framework into the strategic planning process from the outset. This proactive stance ensures that growth initiatives are designed with compliance as a foundational element, rather than an afterthought. Specifically, it aligns with the principles of responsible business conduct and the regulatory expectation that firms operate with integrity and in the best interests of their clients. Adhering to the spirit and letter of the law, as mandated by the CATL framework, is paramount. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on aggressive market expansion, without adequate consideration for regulatory implications, would fail to uphold the duty of care owed to clients, and could expose the firm to significant legal and reputational risks. This would constitute a breach of regulatory requirements, potentially leading to fines, sanctions, and loss of operating licenses. Another incorrect approach, which might involve delegating all compliance oversight to a separate department without embedding it into the strategic decision-making process, would be a failure of leadership and governance. This diffusion of responsibility can lead to oversight gaps and a disconnect between business strategy and regulatory adherence, violating the principle of a strong compliance culture. A third incorrect approach, prioritizing short-term profit over long-term regulatory sustainability, demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of the interconnectedness of financial success and regulatory compliance, which is a cornerstone of the CATL framework. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with a comprehensive review of the relevant regulatory landscape. This should be followed by an assessment of how proposed strategic initiatives align with these regulations. Risk assessment, including potential compliance breaches, should be an integral part of this evaluation. Finally, decisions should be made with a clear understanding of the ethical implications and the firm's fiduciary responsibilities. Question 8. Cost-benefit analysis shows that launching a new, complex financial product with potentially high fees could significantly boost the firm's quarterly profits. However, the product's structure is difficult for many retail investors to fully understand, and its success relies heavily on market volatility, which could lead to substantial losses for some clients. The firm's compliance department has flagged potential disclosure challenges and the risk of mis-selling. What is the most appropriate course of action for the firm? Option A. Launch the product with a strong marketing campaign emphasizing its potential returns, while downplaying the associated risks and complexity in client communications. Option B. Proceed with the launch, but implement enhanced training for sales staff on the product's features and risks, and provide clients with a simplified summary document alongside the full prospectus. Option C. Launch the product immediately to capitalize on the profit potential, relying on the existing disclosure documents and assuming clients will seek clarification if needed. Option D. Delay the launch indefinitely until a simpler, less volatile product can be developed, even if it means missing the current profit opportunity. The correct answer is B. Proceed with the launch, but implement enhanced training for sales staff on the product's features and risks, and provide clients with a simplified summary document alongside the full prospectus. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the potential for increased revenue against the ethical obligation to protect client interests and maintain market integrity. The firm's reputation and client trust are at stake, necessitating a decision that prioritizes compliance and client welfare over short-term financial gains. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it upholds the principles of client duty and market fairness, which are fundamental to the CATL hiring assessment test's regulatory framework. Specifically, it aligns with the expectation that professionals will act with integrity and avoid conflicts of interest that could disadvantage clients or distort market mechanisms. This approach demonstrates a commitment to long-term sustainability and ethical conduct, which are paramount in the financial services industry. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on maximizing short-term profits without adequate consideration for client impact or regulatory adherence would represent a failure to act in the best interests of clients. This could lead to regulatory breaches, fines, and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach that involves misleading clients about the risks or benefits of the new product, or failing to disclose material information, would be a direct violation of disclosure requirements and ethical standards, potentially constituting market abuse. Third incorrect approach that prioritizes the firm's immediate financial gain over the potential systemic risks associated with the product's aggressive promotion would demonstrate a disregard for market stability and regulatory oversight, which are core tenets of responsible financial practice. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying all relevant stakeholders and their interests. This should be followed by a thorough assessment of the potential benefits and risks, both financial and non-financial, associated with each course of action. Crucially, this assessment must be conducted through the lens of the applicable regulatory framework and ethical codes. Professionals should then evaluate each option against these standards, seeking to identify the approach that best aligns with their fiduciary duties, regulatory obligations, and commitment to market integrity. Seeking guidance from compliance departments or legal counsel is also a critical step when faced with complex ethical or regulatory dilemmas. Question 9. The efficiency study reveals that significant cost savings can be achieved by reassigning junior administrative staff to directly handle client inquiries and provide basic advisory services, with the intention of providing formal training at a later stage. What is the most appropriate course of action to balance cost reduction with professional and regulatory obligations? Option A. Implement the reassignment of junior staff to client-facing roles only after they have completed a comprehensive training program relevant to the advisory services they will provide and are placed under direct supervision. Option B. Prioritize the efficiency targets by reassigning junior staff to client-facing roles without immediate additional training, assuming that their general administrative skills will be sufficient for initial client interactions. Option C. Proceed with the reassignment of junior staff to client-facing roles immediately to realize cost savings, with a plan to offer on-the-job training and informal guidance as they gain experience. Option D. Reassign junior staff to client-facing roles, focusing on their ability to follow scripts and predefined answers, and deferring any in-depth training until the efficiency targets are met. The correct answer is A. Implement the reassignment of junior staff to client-facing roles only after they have completed a comprehensive training program relevant to the advisory services they will provide and are placed under direct supervision. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between achieving operational efficiency targets and maintaining the integrity of client advisory services. The pressure to reduce costs by reassigning junior staff to client-facing roles without adequate training or supervision risks compromising the quality of advice, potentially leading to client dissatisfaction, regulatory breaches, and reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to balance business objectives with client welfare and regulatory compliance. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes client interests and regulatory adherence, ensuring that any junior staff assigned to client-facing roles have received appropriate training, possess the necessary competencies, and are adequately supervised directly addresses the risks identified. This aligns with the principles of professional conduct and regulatory expectations that mandate competent advice and client protection. Specifically, it upholds the duty of care owed to clients and adheres to guidelines that require firms to have robust systems and controls in place to ensure staff are qualified and supervised appropriately for the tasks they undertake. Incorrect approaches analysis. Reassigning junior staff without any additional training or supervision is a direct violation of the duty of care owed to clients. It exposes clients to potentially unqualified advice, which could lead to financial harm and breaches of regulatory requirements concerning the provision of financial advice. This approach prioritizes cost saving over client well-being and regulatory compliance. Implementing a learn-as-you-go approach for client interactions, even with the intention of future training, is professionally unacceptable. It places an undue burden on clients to tolerate errors and omissions stemming from inexperience. This practice fails to meet the standards of competence and diligence expected by regulators and clients, potentially leading to breaches of conduct rules. Focusing solely on meeting efficiency targets without considering the impact on client service quality is a failure of professional responsibility. While efficiency is important, it cannot come at the expense of client protection and regulatory adherence. This approach demonstrates a disregard for the firm's obligations and could result in significant regulatory sanctions and loss of client trust. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based approach. Before implementing any changes that affect client service, a thorough assessment of potential risks to clients and regulatory compliance must be conducted. This involves evaluating the competencies of staff, the complexity of client needs, and the adequacy of supervision and training. Decisions should always be guided by the principles of client best interest, professional integrity, and adherence to the regulatory framework. If efficiency gains cannot be achieved without compromising these core principles, alternative solutions must be explored. Question 10. The efficiency study reveals that the current process for administering and scoring the CATL hiring assessment test is time-consuming and resource-intensive. A proposal has been put forward to automate certain aspects of the assessment, including initial candidate screening based on predefined criteria and the generation of standardized feedback reports. What is the most appropriate course of action for the firm to ensure compliance with the CATL hiring assessment test's regulatory framework? Option A. Rely on the vendor's assurances that their automated system is compliant with general hiring regulations, without conducting an independent verification against the CATL hiring assessment test's specific framework. Option B. Proceed with the automation of candidate screening, but delay the generation of standardized feedback reports until a later date, believing that partial implementation minimizes immediate compliance concerns. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive review of the proposed automation against the specific regulatory requirements and guidelines of the CATL hiring assessment test, consulting with the compliance department and legal counsel to assess potential risks and ensure adherence to all applicable laws and ethical standards. Option D. Immediately implement the proposed automation to realize cost savings and improve turnaround times, assuming that efficiency gains inherently align with best practices. The correct answer is D. Immediately implement the proposed automation to realize cost savings and improve turnaround times, assuming that efficiency gains inherently align with best practices. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the pursuit of operational efficiency with the paramount duty of regulatory compliance. The firm's obligation to adhere to the CATL hiring assessment test's regulatory framework means that any proposed efficiency measure must be scrutinized for its potential impact on the integrity and fairness of the assessment process. The challenge lies in identifying improvements that enhance efficiency without compromising the core principles of the CATL framework, which are designed to ensure fair and objective hiring decisions. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough review of the proposed changes against the specific requirements of the CATL hiring assessment test's regulatory framework. This involves understanding the intent behind each regulation, such as those pertaining to data privacy, candidate experience, and the validation of assessment tools. By consulting with the compliance department and legal counsel, the firm ensures that any efficiency gains are achieved within the bounds of the law and ethical guidelines, thereby safeguarding the firm's reputation and avoiding potential penalties. This proactive and compliant approach demonstrates a commitment to responsible business practices. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on cost reduction without considering regulatory implications would fail to uphold the firm's duty of care. For instance, implementing a new assessment platform without verifying its compliance with data protection regulations, e.g., regarding the secure storage and processing of candidate data, could lead to breaches and significant legal repercussions. Another incorrect approach, such as streamlining the candidate feedback process by providing generic, unvalidated responses, would violate principles of fairness and transparency, potentially leading to discrimination claims if the feedback is not objective or is inconsistently applied. These failures stem from a lack of due diligence and an insufficient understanding of the regulatory obligations inherent in the hiring assessment process. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the regulatory landscape governing the specific activity. When considering any change, especially one aimed at efficiency, the first step should be to identify potential regulatory touchpoints. This should be followed by a risk assessment, evaluating the potential compliance risks associated with the proposed change. Consulting with internal compliance and legal experts is crucial to interpret regulations and assess risks. Finally, decisions should be made based on a comprehensive understanding of both the operational benefits and the regulatory and ethical implications, ensuring that efficiency does not come at the cost of compliance. Question 11. The performance metrics show a statistically significant variance in assessment outcomes across different demographic groups within the candidate pool for a recent hiring round. What is the most appropriate next step to ensure compliance with the CATL hiring assessment test framework? Option A. Share the raw performance metrics with external recruitment agencies to solicit their opinions on the observed trends. Option B. Disregard the variance, assuming it reflects natural population differences, and proceed with hiring decisions as planned. Option C. Initiate a confidential internal review to investigate potential biases in the assessment design or administration, adhering to CATL data handling and reporting guidelines. Option D. Immediately publish the raw performance metrics and demographic data to raise awareness of potential disparities. The correct answer is C. Initiate a confidential internal review to investigate potential biases in the assessment design or administration, adhering to CATL data handling and reporting guidelines. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for efficient client service with the stringent regulatory obligations of the CATL hiring assessment test framework, specifically concerning data privacy and integrity. The core tension lies in how to leverage performance data for improvement without inadvertently breaching confidentiality or misrepresenting findings. Careful judgment is required to ensure all actions align with the CATL framework's emphasis on ethical conduct and compliance. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a structured, compliant review process. By initiating an internal review that adheres to the CATL framework's guidelines on data handling and reporting, the firm demonstrates a commitment to regulatory adherence and ethical data utilization. This method ensures that any identified performance gaps are addressed through appropriate channels, respecting the privacy of individuals and the integrity of the assessment process. It aligns with the CATL framework's objective of fostering a compliant and trustworthy environment for hiring assessments. An incorrect approach that involves directly sharing raw performance metrics with external parties without proper anonymization or authorization would represent a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This breaches the CATL framework's implicit and explicit requirements for data confidentiality and privacy, potentially exposing sensitive candidate information. Another incorrect approach, such as ignoring the performance metrics altogether, would fail to uphold the CATL framework's objective of continuous improvement and quality assurance in hiring assessments. This inaction could lead to a decline in assessment quality and a failure to identify systemic issues, thereby undermining the purpose of the assessment. A third incorrect approach, which involves making broad generalizations about candidate pools based on limited or unverified data, risks creating biased perceptions and could lead to discriminatory hiring practices, directly contravening the ethical principles underpinning fair assessment processes as expected within the CATL framework. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the relevant regulatory obligations under the CATL framework. This involves understanding data privacy, reporting, and ethical conduct requirements. Subsequently, they should assess the nature of the performance data and the intended use. The next step is to consider compliant methods for analysis and action, such as internal reviews, anonymized reporting, or seeking guidance from compliance officers. Finally, professionals must document their decision-making process and ensure all actions are justifiable under the CATL framework. Question 12. The audit findings indicate a potential breach of anti-money laundering (AML) regulations by a significant client, involving a series of transactions that appear unusual and lack clear economic purpose. The firm's compliance department has flagged these transactions for further review. The firm's senior management is concerned about the potential impact on the client relationship and the firm's revenue. What is the most appropriate course of action for the firm's compliance department in this situation? Option A. Advise the client of the audit findings and request their explanation for the transactions before taking any further action. Option B. Conduct a thorough internal investigation to gather all relevant facts, assess the nature and materiality of the potential breach, and consult with legal counsel before deciding on any external reporting obligations. Option C. Immediately report the suspicious activity to the relevant regulatory authority, providing all available transaction details without further internal investigation. Option D. Disregard the audit findings as the client is a major revenue generator and the transactions are not definitively proven to be illegal. The correct answer is C. Immediately report the suspicious activity to the relevant regulatory authority, providing all available transaction details without further internal investigation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between client confidentiality and the obligation to report potential regulatory breaches. The firm must navigate the delicate balance of protecting client information while upholding its duty to the regulatory body and the integrity of the financial markets. Careful judgment is required to determine the appropriate course of action without prejudicing the client unnecessarily or failing in its supervisory responsibilities. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough internal investigation before escalating to external reporting. This aligns with regulatory expectations that firms should have robust internal controls and compliance procedures. By gathering all relevant facts internally, the firm can make an informed decision about the nature and severity of the potential breach. This approach demonstrates due diligence and a commitment to resolving issues proactively. Furthermore, it allows the firm to take corrective action internally, which may mitigate the need for formal regulatory intervention and protect the client from undue reputational damage if the issue is minor or a misunderstanding. This proactive stance is ethically sound, as it seeks to rectify potential wrongdoing efficiently and effectively. An incorrect approach that involves immediate reporting without internal investigation would be professionally unacceptable. This would breach client confidentiality unnecessarily and could lead to premature regulatory scrutiny based on incomplete information, potentially harming the client's reputation and business. It fails to demonstrate the firm's commitment to its own internal compliance framework and supervisory duties. Another incorrect approach, which is to ignore the findings due to the client's importance or potential impact on revenue, represents a severe ethical and regulatory failure. This constitutes a dereliction of duty, undermining the integrity of the financial system and exposing the firm to significant penalties. It prioritizes commercial interests over regulatory obligations and ethical conduct. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Acknowledge and document the audit finding. 2. Initiate an immediate, discrete internal review to gather all pertinent facts and evidence. 3. Consult with the firm's compliance and legal departments to assess the findings against relevant regulations. 4. Determine the materiality and nature of any potential breach. 5. If a breach is confirmed, take appropriate internal remedial actions. 6. Based on the severity and nature of the breach, and in consultation with legal and compliance, decide whether external reporting is required by law or regulation. 7. Maintain clear and contemporaneous records of all steps taken and decisions made. Question 13. System analysis indicates that a new hire is tasked with onboarding a high-profile client and needs to gather information on their existing financial arrangements to provide tailored advice. The new hire is aware that some of this information is sensitive and may be held by third-party institutions. The new hire is considering how to best obtain this information to ensure comprehensive advice. Option A. Contacting the client directly to request explicit written consent to approach their existing financial institutions for specific, relevant information. Option B. Attempting to access the client's online banking portals using publicly available information or common password guessing techniques. Option C. Gathering publicly available news articles and social media posts about the client's financial activities to infer their existing arrangements. Option D. Requesting the information from the client's previous advisor without the client's explicit consent, assuming professional courtesy will suffice. The correct answer is A. Contacting the client directly to request explicit written consent to approach their existing financial institutions for specific, relevant information. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge related to regulatory compliance within the CATL hiring assessment test's specified jurisdiction. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need for efficient information gathering with the strict requirements of data privacy and client confidentiality as mandated by the relevant regulatory framework. A new hire must understand that, while obtaining comprehensive information is crucial for effective client service, the methods employed must strictly adhere to legal and ethical boundaries. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes obtaining necessary information through legally permissible and ethically sound channels. This involves seeking explicit consent from the client for any data sharing and ensuring that all information collected is relevant, accurate, and handled with the utmost confidentiality. This aligns with the principles of data protection and client trust, which are fundamental to regulatory compliance and professional integrity. An incorrect approach that involves accessing client information without explicit consent or through unauthorized means constitutes a serious regulatory and ethical failure. It breaches data privacy laws, violates client confidentiality agreements, and erodes trust. Such actions can lead to severe penalties, including fines, reputational damage, and disciplinary action. Another incorrect approach, such as relying on outdated or unverified information, can lead to poor decision-making, misrepresentation, and ultimately, client harm, which is also a failure of professional duty and regulatory expectation. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the applicable regulatory framework. Before taking any action, a professional should ask, "What information do I need? What are the legal and ethical constraints on obtaining this information? What is the most appropriate and compliant method to acquire it? And have I obtained all necessary consents?" If there is any doubt, seeking guidance from a supervisor or the compliance department is essential. This systematic approach ensures that actions are not only effective, but also legally sound and ethically defensible. Question 14. Assessment of how a financial services firm should adapt its Know Your Customer (KIC) procedures to balance regulatory compliance with business efficiency, considering the Proceeds of Crime Act 2002 and the Money Laundering Regulations 2017. Option A. Apply the same comprehensive due diligence checks to every client, regardless of their perceived risk, to ensure no potential issues are overlooked, even if it significantly slows down onboarding. Option B. Implement a risk-based approach to KYC, adjusting the depth of due diligence based on the assessed risk profile of the client and transaction, while ensuring all decisions and actions are thoroughly documented and approved by compliance. Option C. Expedite due diligence for clients identified as high value or strategically important to the firm, prioritizing business relationships over the full application of standard KYC protocols. Option D. Rely exclusively on automated KYC screening tools without any manual review or contextual analysis to streamline the onboarding process. The correct answer is B. Implement a risk-based approach to KYC, adjusting the depth of due diligence based on the assessed risk profile of the client and transaction, while ensuring all decisions and actions are thoroughly documented and approved by compliance. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in regulatory compliance where a firm must balance the need for efficient client onboarding with the stringent requirements of anti-money laundering (AML) regulations. The pressure to meet business targets can create a temptation to streamline processes in ways that might inadvertently compromise compliance. The professional challenge lies in identifying and mitigating these risks without unduly hindering legitimate business activities. It requires a nuanced understanding of the regulatory intent behind Know Your Customer (KIC) procedures and the ability to apply them effectively in a practical, fast-paced environment. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves implementing a risk-based approach to KYC, as mandated by the Proceeds of Crime Act 2002, (POCA), and the Money Laundering Regulations 2017, (MLR). This means that while robust due diligence is always required, the level of due diligence should be proportionate to the assessed risk of the customer and the transaction. For low-risk clients, simplified due diligence measures may be permissible, provided they are adequately documented and approved by compliance. This approach ensures that resources are focused on high-risk areas, thereby enhancing the effectiveness of AML controls while still facilitating business. It aligns with the Financial Conduct Authority's (FCA) guidance on AML, which emphasizes proportionality and risk assessment. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to apply the same exhaustive level of due diligence to every single client, regardless of their risk profile. This is inefficient and can lead to unnecessary delays, potentially harming client relationships and business growth. While seemingly cautious, it fails to adhere to the risk-based principle inherent in POCA and MLRs, which allows for proportionate measures. It also misinterprets the regulatory intent, which is to prevent financial crime, not to create insurmountable barriers for all clients. Another incorrect approach is to bypass or significantly shorten due diligence procedures for clients who are perceived as important or who are bringing in substantial business. This is a direct contravention of POCA and MLRs, as it creates a loophole for potentially higher-risk individuals or entities. Such an approach is ethically unsound and exposes the firm to significant regulatory penalties, reputational damage, and potential criminal liability. It demonstrates a failure to uphold the firm's responsibility to prevent financial crime, prioritizing commercial gain over regulatory and ethical obligations. A third incorrect approach is to rely solely on automated checks without any human oversight or consideration of contextual factors. While automation is a valuable tool, it may not identify all red flags, especially those that require qualitative assessment or an understanding of the client's business activities. Regulations require a comprehensive understanding of the customer, which often necessitates human judgment to interpret the results of automated checks and to perform enhanced due diligence when necessary. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the relevant regulatory framework, POCA, MLR, FCA guidance. This involves assessing the inherent risk associated with different client types and transaction profiles. When onboarding a new client, the first step is to conduct a risk assessment. Based on this assessment, the appropriate level of due diligence should be determined, adhering to the principle of proportionality. If the risk is low, simplified measures may be applied, but these must still be documented and approved. If the risk is medium or high, enhanced due diligence measures must be implemented. Throughout this process, clear documentation of the risk assessment and the due diligence performed is crucial. Regular training and updates on AML regulations and best practices are also essential to ensure ongoing compliance and to foster a culture of integrity within the firm. Question 15. Comparative studies suggest that financial institutions often face dilemmas in balancing client service with regulatory obligations. A client with whom your firm has a long-standing relationship and a generally low-risk profile requests a series of complex international transfers to jurisdictions known for higher money laundering risks. The client provides a plausible but somewhat vague explanation for the transaction. What is the most appropriate regulatory compliant course of action for your firm? Option A. Conduct a thorough internal assessment of the client's request, considering their known business activities, the nature of the jurisdictions involved, and the plausibility of the explanation. If suspicion persists after this assessment, file a suspicious activity report (SAR) with the National Crime Agency (NCA) without informing the client. Option B. Inform the client that their request has raised concerns and ask them to provide more detailed documentation and justification for the transactions. Option C. Proceed with the international transfers as requested, assuming the client's long-standing relationship negates the need for further scrutiny. Option D. Immediately decline the client's request and terminate the business relationship to avoid any potential regulatory scrutiny. Correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough internal assessment of the client's request, considering their known business activities, the nature of the jurisdictions involved, and the plausibility of the explanation. If suspicion persists after this assessment, file a suspicious activity report (SAR) with the National Crime Agency (NCA) without informing the client. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between client confidentiality and the regulatory obligation to report suspicious activities. The firm's reputation, client trust, and potential legal repercussions hinge on navigating this delicate balance correctly. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between legitimate client inquiries and potential money laundering or terrorist financing activities, without prejudicing innocent clients. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to the UK's money laundering regulations, MLR, and the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA handbook. Specifically, it involves a thorough internal assessment of the client's request and the firm's existing knowledge of the client's business and risk profile. If after this assessment, suspicion remains, the firm has a legal and ethical duty to file a suspicious activity report (SAR) with the National Crime Agency (NCA) without tipping off the client. This aligns with the principle of preventing financial crime and upholding the integrity of the financial system, as mandated by the MLRs. An incorrect approach that involves immediately reporting the activity without any internal assessment fails to uphold client confidentiality where it might be warranted and could lead to unnecessary investigations, wasting regulatory resources. It also risks damaging the client relationship without proper justification. Another incorrect approach, which is to ignore the request due to a desire to avoid potential conflict or regulatory scrutiny, represents a severe regulatory failure. This inaction directly contravenes the MLRs, which impose a positive duty to report suspicious transactions. Such a failure could result in significant fines, reputational damage, and potential criminal charges for the firm and individuals involved. A third incorrect approach, which is to seek advice from the client on how to proceed with the transaction, is a direct breach of the MLR's prohibition on tipping off. This action would alert the client to the suspicion, potentially allowing them to proceed with or alter their illicit activities, thereby obstructing justice and undermining the purpose of the reporting regime. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the client's business and risk profile. They must then critically evaluate any unusual or suspicious requests against this backdrop. If suspicion arises, the next step is to consult internal policies and procedures for anti-money laundering (AML) and counter-terrorist financing (CTF). If suspicion persists, a formal internal review should be conducted, documenting all findings. If the suspicion remains, the firm must then follow the established procedure for filing a SAR with the NCA, ensuring no tipping off occurs. This structured approach ensures compliance, protects the firm, and contributes to the broader fight against financial crime. Question 16. The audit findings indicate a potential breach of anti-money laundering (AML) regulations due to a series of transactions processed for a high-risk client that, upon review, appear to lack sufficient due diligence documentation. The firm's compliance officer is aware of the situation and has access to all transaction records and client files. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the compliance officer? Option A. Advise the client of the potential AML breach and request they provide the missing documentation before taking any further action. Option B. Conduct a thorough internal investigation to gather all relevant facts, assess the extent of the potential breach, and determine appropriate remedial actions before considering any external reporting. Option C. Disregard the audit findings as they are preliminary and may not represent a definitive breach, focusing instead on ongoing client relationships. Option D. Immediately report the potential breach to the relevant regulatory authority, providing all available transaction data without further internal review. The correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough internal investigation to gather all relevant facts, assess the extent of the potential breach, and determine appropriate remedial actions before considering any external reporting. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between client confidentiality and the obligation to report potential regulatory breaches. The firm must navigate this delicate balance, ensuring that client trust is maintained while upholding its legal and ethical responsibilities. Careful judgment is required to determine the appropriate course of action without prejudicing the client unnecessarily or failing in its supervisory duties. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough internal investigation before escalating to external regulatory bodies. This aligns with the principles of proportionality and due diligence expected of regulated firms. By gathering all relevant facts internally, the firm can accurately assess the situation, identify the root cause, and implement appropriate remedial actions. This proactive stance demonstrates a commitment to regulatory compliance and responsible business conduct, minimizing potential harm to both the client and the market. It also allows for a more informed and targeted communication with the regulator, should that become necessary. An incorrect approach that involves immediate reporting without internal investigation would be professionally unacceptable. This would likely breach client confidentiality unnecessarily and could lead to premature regulatory intervention based on incomplete information, potentially damaging the client's reputation and business without proper justification. It also fails to demonstrate the firm's capacity for self-governance and problem-solving. Another incorrect approach, that of ignoring the findings to avoid conflict or reputational damage, represents a severe regulatory and ethical failure. This constitutes a dereliction of duty, exposing the firm and its clients to significant risks, including potential fines, sanctions, and loss of license. It undermines the integrity of the financial system and demonstrates a lack of professional responsibility. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Acknowledge and document the audit findings immediately. 2. Initiate a confidential internal review to gather all pertinent facts and understand the context of the findings. This may involve consulting with legal counsel and compliance officers. 3. Assess the severity and potential impact of the identified issues against relevant regulatory requirements. 4. Determine the appropriate course of action based on the findings, considering internal remediation, client communication, and, if necessary, external reporting. 5. Maintain clear and accurate records of all steps taken and decisions made throughout the process. Question 17. To address the challenge of accurately assessing a client's risk profile for investment advice, which of the following approaches best demonstrates professional diligence and adherence to regulatory expectations? Option A. Using the client's age as the primary factor in determining their acceptable level of investment risk. Option B. Prioritizing investment recommendations based on the client's expressed desire for aggressive growth, without a thorough evaluation of their ability to withstand potential downturns. Option C. Conducting a detailed discussion about the client's financial capacity for loss, their past investment experiences, and their emotional responses to market volatility, in addition to using a standardized risk assessment tool. Option D. Relying solely on the results of a standardized risk tolerance questionnaire, assuming it comprehensively captures all relevant factors. The correct answer is C. Conducting a detailed discussion about the client's financial capacity for loss, their past investment experiences, and their emotional responses to market volatility, in addition to using a standardized risk assessment tool. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a financial advisor to move beyond a superficial understanding of risk and delve into the client's nuanced perception and tolerance for risk. Simply relying on a standardized questionnaire, while a common starting point, can be insufficient. The challenge lies in identifying potential misalignments between a client's stated risk tolerance and their actual capacity and willingness to bear risk, especially in the face of market volatility or significant life events. Overlooking these nuances can lead to investment strategies that are either too conservative, hindering wealth accumulation, or too aggressive, exposing the client to unacceptable losses and potential distress. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a multifaceted assessment that combines quantitative data with qualitative insights. This aligns with regulatory expectations, such as those found in the UK's Financial Conduct Authority (FCA) Handbook E.g. COBS 9A, which mandate that firms must ensure that financial promotions and advice are fair, clear, and not misleading, and that investments are suitable for the client. A deep dive into the client's financial situation, including their income, expenses, assets, liabilities, and future financial goals, establishes their capacity for risk. Crucially, engaging in open dialogue to understand their past investment experiences, their emotional response to market fluctuations, and their overall comfort level with potential losses provides insight into their willingness to take risk. This holistic approach ensures that the recommended investment strategy is not only technically appropriate, but also psychologically aligned with the client's needs and expectations, fostering trust and long-term client relationships. Incorrect approach is analysis. Relying solely on a standardized risk questionnaire without further probing is professionally unacceptable because it fails to capture the full spectrum of a client's risk profile. This approach risks a regulatory breach under suitability requirements, as it may lead to recommendations that are not truly appropriate for the individual. It also presents an ethical failure by not exercising due diligence in understanding the client's unique circumstances and emotional disposition towards risk. Suggesting an investment strategy based primarily on the client's stated desire for high returns, without adequately assessing their capacity to absorb potential losses, is another professionally unacceptable approach. This overlooks the fundamental principle of risk management and could lead to a significant breach of suitability rules. Ethically, it prioritizes potential commission over the client's financial well-being and security, focusing exclusively on the client's age as the primary determinant of risk tolerance is an oversimplification that ignores individual circumstances. While age can be a factor in time horizon, it does not dictate an individual's willingness or capacity to bear risk. This approach is a failure of due diligence and can lead to unsuitable recommendations, violating regulatory requirements for personalized advice. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a client-centric decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the client's financial situation, objectives, and risk profile. This involves active listening, probing questions, and the use of appropriate assessment tools. The process should then involve matching these client-specific factors to suitable investment products and strategies, always prioritizing the client's best interests. Regular reviews and ongoing dialogue are essential to adapt to changing circumstances and ensure continued suitability. This systematic approach, grounded in regulatory compliance and ethical conduct, builds client confidence and safeguards against potential missteps. Question 18. The control framework reveals that the firm's approach to risk assessment has historically relied heavily on automated transaction monitoring systems. While this has been effective in flagging high-volume suspicious activities, there is a growing concern that emerging risks, particularly those related to novel financial products and evolving client behaviors, may not be adequately captured. Considering the CATL hiring assessment test's emphasis on regulatory compliance and ethical conduct, which of the following approaches to enhancing the risk assessment process would best align with best professional practice and regulatory expectations? Option A. Implement a multi-layered approach that combines automated monitoring with regular qualitative reviews by experienced risk analysts, incorporating forward-looking scenario analysis and expert judgment to identify and assess a broader spectrum of risks. Option B. Shift the primary focus of risk assessment to solely monitoring the volume and frequency of transactions, assuming that higher volumes inherently indicate higher risk. Option C. Rely exclusively on external threat intelligence reports to identify emerging risks, reducing the internal resources dedicated to proactive risk assessment. Option D. Increase the sensitivity thresholds of existing automated monitoring systems to capture a wider range of potential anomalies, without introducing additional human review processes. The correct answer is A. Implement a multi-layered approach that combines automated monitoring with regular qualitative reviews by experienced risk analysts, incorporating forward-looking scenario analysis and expert judgment to identify and assess a broader spectrum of risks. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for timely risk identification with the practical limitations of resource allocation and the potential for over-reliance on automated systems. The firm must ensure its risk assessment process is robust enough to capture emerging threats without becoming overly burdensome or prone to false positives. Careful judgment is required to select an approach that is both effective and efficient, adhering to regulatory expectations for a comprehensive and dynamic risk management system. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it integrates multiple data sources and human oversight, aligning with regulatory expectations for a thorough and adaptable risk assessment. This method acknowledges that, while technology is valuable, human expertise is crucial for interpreting complex signals, understanding context, and making nuanced judgments about the severity and likelihood of identified risks. This proactive and layered approach demonstrates a commitment to identifying and mitigating risks before they materialize, which is a core tenet of sound financial regulation and ethical conduct. An incorrect approach that relies solely on automated alerts without human review fails to meet regulatory standards for due diligence and risk management. It risks overlooking subtle but significant risks that automated systems might not flag, or conversely, generating excessive noise that distracts from genuine threats. This can lead to regulatory breaches due to a lack of adequate oversight and a failure to implement effective controls. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes only high-volume transaction monitoring over qualitative risk factors neglects the multifaceted nature of risk. Regulatory frameworks emphasize a holistic view, considering not just the frequency of transactions, but also their nature, the client's profile, and the broader market environment. Ignoring qualitative aspects can lead to a misallocation of resources and a failure to identify risks associated with less frequent, but potentially more damaging activities. A further incorrect approach that focuses exclusively on historical data without considering forward-looking indicators is also deficient. While historical data provides valuable insights, it is insufficient for anticipating future risks, especially in rapidly evolving financial markets. Regulatory bodies expect firms to engage in forward-looking risk assessment, incorporating scenario analysis and stress testing, to understand potential future vulnerabilities. Professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured assessment of available resources, the firm's risk appetite, and the specific regulatory requirements. Professionals should consider a blended approach that leverages technology for efficiency while ensuring human expertise is applied for critical analysis and judgment. This involves establishing clear protocols for reviewing automated outputs, incorporating qualitative data, and regularly updating risk assessment methodologies to reflect changing market conditions and emerging threats. A continuous feedback loop between operational teams and risk management functions is essential for maintaining an effective and compliant control framework. Question 19. The evaluation methodology shows a firm has identified a list of potential operational risks. Which of the following best describes the most effective approach to risk assessment in this context, ensuring compliance with regulatory expectations for a robust risk management framework? Option A. Focusing on the sheer volume of identified risks, assuming that a larger number indicates a more comprehensive understanding of potential threats. Option B. Conducting a superficial review of each identified risk without a consistent methodology for assessing its severity or probability. Option C. Relying on the subjective opinions of senior management regarding which risks appear most concerning, without a structured evaluation process. Option D. Prioritizing risks based on a combination of their potential impact on the firm's objectives and the likelihood of their occurrence, using a defined risk matrix. The correct answer is D. Prioritizing risks based on a combination of their potential impact on the firm's objectives and the likelihood of their occurrence, using a defined risk matrix. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a nuanced understanding of risk assessment beyond simple identification. The firm must not only recognize potential risks, but also effectively prioritize them based on their potential impact and likelihood, aligning with regulatory expectations for robust risk management frameworks. The challenge lies in moving from a reactive identification of risks to a proactive, strategic assessment that informs resource allocation and control implementation. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it involves a systematic and documented process of identifying, analyzing, and evaluating risks. This aligns with the principles of good governance and regulatory compliance, which mandate that firms have effective systems and controls in place to manage risks. Specifically, a comprehensive risk assessment that considers both the likelihood and impact of identified risks allows for informed decision-making regarding mitigation strategies, ensuring that resources are directed towards the most significant threats. This proactive stance is crucial for maintaining financial stability and protecting client interests, as expected by regulatory bodies. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the number of identified risks without considering their severity or probability is professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a superficial understanding of risk management and fails to meet regulatory requirements for a proportionate and effective risk assessment. Such an approach could lead to misallocation of resources, leaving the firm vulnerable to high-impact risks while expending effort on minor ones. Another incorrect approach, which relies on anecdotal evidence or personal opinions rather than a structured methodology, lacks objectivity and auditability. This can result in biased assessments and a failure to identify systemic risks, potentially leading to regulatory breaches and reputational damage. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining the scope and objectives of the risk assessment. This should be followed by a systematic process of risk identification, using a variety of sources and techniques. Crucially, each identified risk must then be analyzed and evaluated based on its likelihood and potential impact, using defined criteria. This analysis should inform the prioritization of risks, guiding the development and implementation of appropriate mitigation strategies. Regular review and monitoring of the risk landscape are also essential components of an effective risk management process. Question 20. Compliance review shows that our firm's rapid growth has outpaced the development of our risk assessment framework. To address this, which of the following approaches would best ensure comprehensive and effective risk management in line with regulatory expectations? Option A. Develop a dynamic risk assessment framework that incorporates both qualitative and quantitative analysis, considers inherent and residual risks, and includes a schedule for regular review and updates based on internal and external changes. Option B. Conduct a one-time comprehensive risk assessment and document it, assuming that the identified risks will remain constant for the foreseeable future. Option C. Implement a purely quantitative risk assessment model, focusing solely on measurable financial impacts and disregarding qualitative factors. Option D. Rely primarily on historical incident data to identify and quantify risks, assuming that past patterns will accurately predict future vulnerabilities. The correct answer is A. Develop a dynamic risk assessment framework that incorporates both qualitative and quantitative analysis, considers inherent and residual risks, and includes a schedule for regular review and updates based on internal and external changes. Explanation: Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the compliance officer to balance the need for thorough risk assessment with the practical constraints of limited resources and time. The firm is experiencing rapid growth, which inherently increases its risk profile. Without a robust and adaptable risk assessment framework, the firm could be exposed to significant regulatory breaches, financial losses, and reputational damage. The challenge lies in identifying and prioritizing the most critical risks in a dynamic environment, ensuring that the assessment is both comprehensive and actionable. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a multifaceted strategy that integrates qualitative and quantitative methods, considers both inherent and residual risks, and emphasizes ongoing monitoring and review. This aligns with best professional practice by ensuring a holistic understanding of the firm's risk landscape. Specifically, it reflects the principles of a risk-based approach, which is a cornerstone of regulatory compliance. By considering the likelihood and impact of identified risks, and then evaluating the effectiveness of existing controls, the firm can prioritize resources to mitigate the most significant threats. The emphasis on regular updates and scenario planning ensures that the risk assessment remains relevant in a changing business environment, thereby fulfilling the firm's duty of care and regulatory obligations. Incorrect approaches analysis. Focusing solely on historical data without considering emerging risks is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Regulations often require firms to be forward-looking and proactive in identifying potential threats, not just reactive to past incidents. This approach can lead to blind spots and an underestimation of future vulnerabilities. Implementing a purely quantitative model without qualitative judgment ignores the nuances of operational and reputational risks, which are often difficult to quantify but can have severe consequences. This can result in a skewed perception of risk, potentially overlooking critical non-financial threats. Adopting a static, one-time risk assessment without a plan for regular review or updates is another critical failure. The regulatory environment and the firm's business operations are constantly evolving. A static assessment quickly becomes obsolete, failing to identify new or changing risks and rendering the firm vulnerable to non-compliance. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach risk assessment by first understanding the firm's strategic objectives and operational context. This involves identifying all potential risk categories relevant to the business, such as operational, financial, compliance, strategic, and reputational risks. Next, they should employ a combination of qualitative e.g., expert judgment, scenario analysis, and quantitative e.g., statistical analysis, financial modeling, techniques to assess the likelihood and impact of each identified risk. This assessment should consider both inherent risks before controls and residual risks after controls. Crucially, the process must include a robust framework for monitoring, reviewing, and updating the risk assessment regularly, especially in response to changes in the business, market, or regulatory landscape. This iterative process ensures that risk management remains an active and effective component of the firm's governance and compliance framework.